Hello, my name's Sue and I teach English Literature at Sheffield Hallam University. Perhaps you're thinking about doing an English Literature degree. One of the questions students frequently ask us is what's the difference between reading literary texts at university and further education, particularly in terms of the pace of the reading and the reading load. Well, at Sheffield Hallam, when you begin a degree with us, you will build on your fantastic skills of analysis and critical thinking achieved before. But all your first year modules will help you transition to higher education by supporting you with new ways of approaching and managing your reading of literary texts. It is true that you will have to read more text within a shorter time frame, but you do have independent study time in order to do that. Really importantly, your modules all have a particular focus and particular critical lenses or perspectives with which to approach your reading. Lectures, seminars and tutorials open up a dialogue about your texts and topics under discussion in order to bring a really sharp focus to the way that we study our text and manage our reading load. You will be introduced to secondary reading. This is other people's critical perspectives on the texts and topics you are studying. Perhaps you've encountered different critical approaches while studying, for example, A-level. Well, we build on that. But importantly, we use our time to weigh up and evaluate what other critics have said against your own readings. Again, this brings a sharp focus to the way that you approach the reading of your texts, because ultimately it is your critical voice that matters. You're in a dialogue with literature and with other critics, and we will help you develop your critical voice, which again aids the way that you approach your reading and manage your reading load. One of the other things that we do is really encourage you and support you in understanding ways that you can learn to linger on particular aspects of the text. And these are the things that are important to your critical judgments and the module's focus. And perhaps let the rest of it fade a little bit more into the background. But you must ask, isn't everything in the text important? Well, it is. But as said, while we read the old text, our close analysis and our dialogue and our discussions is all about the module focus and the critical lenses we bring, and of course, how you are part of that debate with your own critical judgment. Now, one of the other things I want to talk a little bit more about is that idea of your own critical judgment and your critical voice. You may have experienced lots of different ways of approaching literature at A-level or other further education courses. But we really want to introduce you or reintroduce you to the idea that your voice is important because literature has very open possibilities for meaning and interpretation. And just as one example, this is the opening of a poem by Christina Rossetti, Goblin Market from 1862. Morning and evening, maids heard the goblins cry, "Come buy our orchard's fruits, come buy, come buy." You may have heard of this poem before. If not, I do suggest you read it. But one of the things about this poem is it's unusual for Christina Rossetti in terms of her other poetry. But crucially, critics have been fascinated with this poem just as many other literary texts because it has indeterminate meaning. It is open to endless possibilities. So just as an example, this text has been read through ideas of warning, empowerment, sexuality, gender, the literary market of the time, religion, capitalism, addiction, empire, bodies, and that's just scratching the surface. Now, critics research, study and bring together their ideas through a combination of close readings, those linguistic building blocks of the text, and the further context and theoretical lenses they bring to bear. But because we will be helping you find your own critical voice, you will have some confidence as you move through your first year to engage in that dialogue, but for you to see that your interpretation of this poem or any other that you may come across reading English is just as important as anyone else's. And let me just have another little fun example. As said, Other critics are important, research in context is extremely important. But always do start with a text and find your own critical voice, and don't be overwhelmed by what other people have to say. Now this poem by William Carlos Williams, The Red Wheelbarrow, is what's known as an imagist poem. And perhaps one thing you could do is look up that term, imagist poem. But really I want you to read this and just think a little bit about how you feel. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rain water, beside the white chickens. Now there's no great reveal here. I just want you to think a bit how it feels. You can perhaps think about that first line, so much depends, and the modifiers throughout this poem, and the images and feelings it creates in your mind. And I am sure that your critical interpretation will be strong and good. You can research around it, look at what the critics have said, but you will have a meaning and find a meaning in this poem that is important to you. And just as an example, why sometimes we do have to trust ourselves with the text first and then research around the context or theoretical approaches. I just want to read something from one of those sites that try to summarise poetry. Now the writer of this particular thing online wants to tell us to begin with that the poem is about a red wheelbarrow, in case we're unsure. And then the writer tells us that the first line leaves us in suspense. And then tells us that a red wheelbarrow could be a farming implement or used for everyday life. And then moves on to say that the wheelbarrow is glazed with rain. That means it's glazed, the writer repeats, which means that it may be shiny or sparkling. But then the writer notes that Carlos Williams introduces some white chickens, in case we're unclear from reading the poem, and then speculates it could be a rural setting, but we have to remember that sometimes urban folk keep chickens. The reason for illustrating that is always start with a text. Always write down and note your feelings. A poem is full of information. Trust that it wants to give you a message and is in a dialogue with you. And then begin to look at other critical perspectives, not those sites. And then think about how your voice is in debate with those voices, and just be as confident as anyone else. Now finally, just to bring things a little bit together, you might ask, is there anything else I can do to practice now? Well, for this, I just want to think a little bit about that idea of pace and lingering on a text, and making sure that you're looking for the trees in the wood. And this is what I'm going to suggest you try. Choose a literary text, anything that you really love and enjoy. And what I want you to do is zoom in on any parts of the text as you're reading through, and only those parts that represent physical objects. This is your little bit of close analysis, taking into account the whole text more generally. And every time you find an object, it could be clothing, or a car, or furniture, ask yourself, is the object associated with a character's feelings, motives, or social status? Make some notes. Also ask yourself, are the objects important to plot development? So one example, for example, if you've ever read Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, the locket. Oliver's mother's locket is important to plot development. And then also ask yourself, does any representation seem unusual, odd, or out of place? And finally, how do these representations link to my wider understanding of the text's possible meanings? There's no definite answer here, but this is about focusing on particular parts of the text, trusting yourself and your critical judgment, letting the rest fade a little, so you're lingering and skipping, and at that point, do some research. Well, thank you very much for listening, and I hope to meet you again in another presentation.